All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on this episode of The Freed Thinker. As always, I'm your host, Tyler Vela. I have a really fun episode for you today. I am joined by two friends. I'm going to drop them in here, Dale and David. For those familiar with some of my appearances on other shows, you may have seen both of them. I cannot highly recommend them more than I can. I don't know. I'm losing the cliche. But two really, really bright guys, really, really great to talk to. So Dale and David, thank you so much for joining. I'll have you do introductions here in a moment. Our topic today is going to be on Molinism, free will, incompatibilism, compatibilism, kind of everything in that range, but specifically hubbed around the idea or the system known as Molinism, which Dale will get through here in a moment. So if you're familiar with that topic, great. Start having your questions lined up. If you're not, Dale's going to have an option here to tell us a little bit about it. And yeah, so let's dive right in, and we'll actually just go left to right here. Dale, why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself, and we'll go from there.
Yeah. So when I started out, so I was a Christian. I grew up a Christian in the Protestant Baptist tradition and that sort of thing. Around 10 to 12 years ago or so, but I guess 13 now, I lost my faith just like you. And I kind of walked away from the Christian faith because I no longer believed it. I had certain, what I call negative evidences now that I felt I needed to reckon with until before I'd be able to say, yes, I actually believe this. So that kind of started me off on a 10-year religious quest or journey, looking at the evidences for and against the various religions. I was lucky enough to, work with certain scholars and become friends with some, like Gary Habermas, Tony Costa, for example, Mike Lacona. These guys were very helpful. But then in May 5th, 2018, I basically came to the conclusion that Christianity uniquely was the true religion, or at the very least, the religion endorsed by God. With a 53.14% subjective credence level there. So, at that point, I became a Christian, and I had the fortunate or unfortunate circumstance of meeting this guy over here, David, the atheist, and we became friends, and we started up a podcast called Skeptics and Seekers, where each week we would write up a blog and counter blog, and then kind of debate an issue of theology or philosophy of religion, whatever it was. Sometimes we would bring on special guests to interview or do debates and that sort of thing. And then eventually I branched out and I did Real Seekers. So that was basically the same thing, just on my own kind of thing. I'm the host of Real Seekers now, and you can catch me over there and doing shows.
Awesome. Thank you so much. David, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okie dokie. Once upon a time, I was a Christian. I was born in the church. My father was a preacher. I followed in the footsteps, I suppose you could say. And so I was, a leader of the church in some description for most of my life, including my childhood and teen years. I became a preacher for a little while at a congregation. I had serious doubts about the truth of the truth claims of my congregation, and as a result of that, moved away. I did not leave the faith. I did try other faiths. I did examine everything more closely. I have been a leader of some description in 3 different denominations, and so I did not walk away from Christianity easily or lightly, but walk away I eventually did. Fast forward lots of years, and here I am talking to you.
Now, David, you didn't say, was it fortunate or unfortunate that you met me?
I don't see why we have to choose.
Okay, it's both. Okay, very good.
Depends on the day, I guess.
It was. I think one of the more fortunate things that ever happened in my life.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree.
Nice. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for joining. I'm looking forward to the participation in the discussion here. So we are starting off the discussion on the topic of Molinism. And Dale, for most of my audience will be somewhat familiar with Molinism. I've had Colton Carlson on here quite a few times. We reviewed a lot of Tim Stratton's posts, videos, debate. And I've done back when I was still doing the podcast, and then on here, done a lot of responses to the metaphysics of Molinism and grounding objections, and been in a lot of discussions and several debates about Molinism. So from anyone that has been following this show, should be somewhat familiar with it. But for those who aren't, or those who started following kind of after my deconversion, I may not be that familiar with it. In a nutshell, because it's such a nutshellable thing, what is Molinism, and why do you think it matters?
Yeah, so what is Molinism is apparently a complicated question. I in preparing for the show, I kind of looked at some of your shows, and so I know that some people make this distinction between mere Molinism versus Molinism proper. I'll be honest, I haven't thought that much in terms of the definition, but there are certain components that I think are necessary. So obviously the first is God has this thing called middle knowledge, right? So God has natural knowledge. He knows all necessary truths and that sort of thing. He has free knowledge, where he knows once he creates all the facts of the actual world and that sort of thing. Then he has this category of middle knowledge, which is where he can know certain counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, as William Lane Craig would put it. He knows what any free creature would do in any given set of situations, or any possible world, as philosophers say. So that's a key component. Another one that I thought was a key component, but I'm going to be asking you about, is, so I think that we also have to have libertarian free will. Now, I know that there's distinctions between limited libertarian free will and stuff, so I'm going to be asking you about that earlier. But yeah, for the sake of argument, I thought libertarian free will was a necessary thing. The other component, I also appeal to possible worlds, and I think that the God-only world and this world are the two best possible worlds, best defined in the fact that the maximum number of human beings possible achieve their ultimate purpose in creation. So those are at least the three elements that I think I need to address things like the problem of evil or hiddenness of God and stuff. What was the second aspect after what?
Why does it matter? Why do you think it matters?
Yeah, so I kind of hinted at that, right? So I think this is key. I mean, for me personally, back when I lost my faith, I went through a 6-month period of agnosticism, and who gets to say this? William Lane Craig saved my life, literally. Molinism, learning about that, was able to put the pieces together and deal with something like the problem of evil. It allowed for me to see that, yeah, God is sovereign. I didn't know that term at the time, but he was providentially in control of everything that happens. And yet we still have this free will that preserves and explains why bad stuff happens. So like that understanding kind of thing had immense significance. It allowed me to not only save my life, but allowed me to make sense of things like the problem of evil, hiddenness of God. Molinism can explain things like the inspiration of the Bible. You can apply that to how God inspired the Bible on a supervisory model, for example. So, yeah, I think it has a wide range of applications that are theologically important.
Okay. Well, and I'm sure this is there's a lot of topics that are related to this, a lot of ancillary topics. I'm not sure we'll get into them, because I actually think that inspiration is like one of the death nails for Molinism, at least any meaningful concept of it. So maybe we can talk about that. I think there's actually a major problem there. So it's interesting that you brought that up as a strong explanatory point for it.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start off, I guess, with you said as part of just the definition, kind of the definitional aspect of it. Well, actually, let me do this before we get started, because you term dropped. but I want to make sure everyone understands. So you said that God has this thing called middle knowledge, right? So how would you understand what middle knowledge is, in compared to say God's natural or his free knowledge?
So obviously middle, it's kind of in between those, but from my understanding, it's kind of with respect to free will and stuff like that. It's God has knowledge of certain counterfactuals or hypothetical or conditional situations and stuff involving people's free will. So again, like I said, he knows what I would do if I was in this situation and someone tempted me with a cookie. I would freely choose to eat that through my own free will or not, kind of thing. So,
well, so let me frame this and see how you're comfortable with this, because the way that I understand it, at least for Protestants, right, and really, probably even for more too, the ones that have more systematically robust views, it seems like some of the main views are like some type of Augustinian view, more like it falls under Reform, but it's a more Augustinian view where God's knowledge is rooted in his decree. God knows because he decreed that something would happen. That actually is the grounding for how he knows it. You could have a simple foreknowledge view, which my honest assessment is just kind of like it's brute. We don't know. Stop asking us questions, and we don't want to talk about it. That's a little crass. It's a little more robust than that. But at the end of the day, anyways, Molinism has this middle knowledge, which I'll come back to in a second, and then open theism. Open theism is say, well, God doesn't know these future things, these future facts of free will. He knows them as possibilities in the future, but he doesn't actually know the truth values, because the truth values are indeterminate. There is no truth value to be known yet, because the decision hasn't been known yet, and so God has this knowledge in some way, in a contingent manner, right? So, circling back to Molinism then is this idea that God has this middle knowledge. So you have his natural knowledge, which is his knowledge of his own nature, necessary facts, all that kinds of those kinds of things. He has his free knowledge, which is his knowledge of creation, of what's actually true in the actual world. Middle knowledge is prior to creation. He has these kind of counterfactual knowledge of what libertarianly free creatures would do in certain circumstances. He then takes that knowledge, he then actualizes or weakly actualizes, depending on how you define it, which world it's going to be. And so a certain set of that middle knowledge becomes his free knowledge, right? It just becomes what is true in the actual world. Because once he creates this actual world, it now becomes, those are no longer counterfactuals; those are now actual factuals. Fact statements. They're true propositions of the actual.
It changes from like would to he will eat that cookie or something.
It is, will, has, right? There are now other problems to rescue this. You now may have to go into it, God being time bound, but we'll put a pin in that for now. So is that kind of a fair lay of the land? So you're going to fall, as a classical theist, I'm still going to be far more sympathetic to like an Augustinian or Reformed understanding of the relationship of God's knowledge and providence and free will. Molinism, you think I've charitably kind of described what that middle knowledge is?
I think so, because I think you kind of accept the fact. In terms of the grounding objection, it could be grounded in God decrees this. To me, when I heard that, though, it sounds like, well, decreed on the basis of what? And that's where I think middle knowledge would be more helpful in probing a bit further, right? So I don't think just saying, well, grounded in his decree settles the issue for me. I want to probe a little bit deeper. And I'm saying he decrees that because kind of he knows what they would freely choose to do. And in terms of addressing the grounding, I think possible worlds, they're not abstract objects. There are no abstract objects. They're grounded internally in God, not externally. And I know that was kind of an issue you had. So they're grounded in God's causal power, right? They're certain causal potentials that God has and that he can actualize and that sort of thing. So that's what I would say kind of grounds God's middle knowledge is his own causal power and potential.
So, so I'm not sure what it's from there, because I think you may have just conceded Molinism is false.
Okay.
Because if God's middle knowledge is grounded in his right, so okay, let me back up. On the more Augustinian, I'm just going to say Reform view, because that's generally what it is. Just caveat: this is not like a Reform Calvinist thing. It's more of a classical theist type of view, right?
Okay.
In that case, God is the ground of all being, right? And he's the truth maker, right? So the ground of all truth of all things, right? So the way that I've described it and how I understand it in the past, to get around like that type of grounding objection, is to say, well, God has effectively the difference between middle knowledge and just exhaustive counterfactual knowledge is where the ultimate source is from, right? Because on a classical theist view, you can middle knowledge is actually kind of just an expression of natural knowledge, right? You can have this predicate prior to it of, if I decree X, then X will happen, right? So his own natural knowledge and his decree grounds all of that exhaustive counterfactual knowledge. You don't have to go through this stuff about libertarian freedom. On middle knowledge, God has this exhaustive knowledge of what libertarianly free creatures would do. Remember, this is a libertarian assumption. This is what the libertarian free creatures would do in any given context, right? And the whole point of this is to rescue, maybe that's too strong of a term, is to make coherent God's exhaustive foreknowledge, right? The Molinists are not open theists, right? They believe that God is omniscience in the omniscient in the classical sense, right? So God has all of this omniscience, and God has providentially predestined whatever comes to pass in the actual world. But you're a libertarian incompatibilist, so you have to say, so the free will is still incompatibly free. So how does that happen? Well, God's knowledge is based on what the agent would libertarianly choose to do in that context, and he has that middle knowledge prior to creation, right? And so the agent is still the ultimate source of that decision. We're going to go into the metaphysical weeds of that, because I have all kinds of issues with that. But the difference there is that middle knowledge, when you say, well, you avoid the grounding of it because it's rooted in God's power. God has created the agent to do such, right? You've now just punted that ball back into the Augustinian realm, where God is the thing that is causally determining what that agent's nature is, such that it will choose that in that context.
So I don't think I'm doing that, actually, because God's causal power is not determinative, right? In that way. So obviously, yeah, I do take the thing that their natures, all of that, they play influences, but they don't determine the person's choice, right? Under the categorical ability to do or not to do. What is it that God is basing the decision on? It's the actualized will. So in potential form, he knows if this guy's will was actualized, his will would just choose not to do this or something. And that's how I think there's that difference between logically possible, which grounds the categorical ability, and then feasible. And at the point of actualized will, I think, yeah, you're going to probably raise objections to that with the randomness objection or something like that. But that's where I'll just throw up my hands.
No, I generally just pose metaphysical problems with it. So I have quite a few, and I don't mean to just like come at you, but right out the gate, I have all these I have all these questions and all these I don't follow that, right? So there's for example, you brought up feasibility, right? So there's this difference between logically possible worlds and logically feasible worlds, right? So there may be a logically possible world where I decide to eat dog poop for dinner. But given my nature, there's no feasible world where I'm going to freely choose that, right?
Yeah.
So the idea is that God can't actualize a world where I freely choose to eat dog poop for dinner tonight, right? Because it's just not feasible. So part of me just wants to go, why not? right? Because if there is nothing about my nature that is determinative of the thing that I choose, if it is just indeterminate, I don't know why not. And if God's omnipotence is defined as the ability to do any logically possible thing, it seems definitionally God should be able to do that. So the way around it then seems to be some theological gerrymandering where omnipotence needs to be redefined, not as God is able to do any logically possible thing, but where God is only able to do things that are feasible in conjunction with libertarianly free agents, delimiting which choices, delimiting which worlds God can actually create. So if God desired to create a world where I would freely choose to eat dog poop, that's a logically possible thing. But now the omnipotent God can't do a logically possible thing. He can only do a feasible thing where I cooperate and delimit the things that he can choose.
Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly what I would say, right? Because I think that, between strictly logically possible worlds and broadly logical possible worlds, or what we're calling feasible worlds and stuff like that, like, ultimately we're testing out that there is a logical contradiction, and that's why non-feasible worlds are not possible to do either, for God to actualize and that sort of thing. Well, what is it that's causing that contradiction? And this, it's not a brute fact, but it's just I can't probe beyond this. It's the actualized will. It's just, we will never orient our will in such a way that we would choose to, do the strictly logical possible opposite in those exact same things.
But why?
It's just because that's what our wills will never choose it. It's just the way our wills are.
But why is the will that way? So I'm going to keep asking the but why question. Well, I'll say I'm not going to. We could do it. I'm going to do it because ultimately the answer, and this I think is where I was pushing back on you.
Mm-hmm.
As a theist, and especially as a Christian, you have to say it's because God decided to create it that way. There's no other explanation for why my will is the state of. Now you can go from will to it's not what I desire to it's not what my taste buds want to it's not right. Every time you give a causal explanation, I can say, but why? Because ultimately, what I want to go back down to is what ontologically grounds that thing, and you're going to have to get back to, in good reform parlance, by the good pleasure of God. That's what He decided to create you as. Which then that now is your answer to the grounding problem. But now Molinism has a problem because you're right back to God, God's desire and prescription of what, or just, decree of what is going to be is actually the thing that causally determined that specific chain to take place, as opposed to another chain.
Well, again, I think that the actualized will, like I could just take a page out of Alexander Pruse's thing to give an answer to that. But again, it's just kicking the can down the road a bit, right? So, okay, I'm exposed to certain sets of influences and that sort of thing. My nature, all this stuff are influences, and I will to orient my will towards one set of influences over another. And then I actualize that. But again, you're going to say, well, okay, well, how are you willing to orient your will? And that's where I think Alexander Pruse's take on the principle of sufficient reason is the answer. I don't have it here in front of me, so I would read it, but I understand why that's not satisfactory and stuff, right? But I think it is if we just take it as that's just the way an actualized will things works, kind of thing, right? It's a prime mover. And so I know you want to say something, but I have a question for you. So what do you want to
just a quick question, because this is where I find William Lane Craig v. William Lane Craig, because it seems like to support Molinism, the principle of sufficient reason has to be heavily modified, if not flat out denied. But in order to support the Kalam and contingency arguments, it has to be full force, kind of a stronger principle of sufficient reason in place. So there's a certain sense where I want to say, what what William Lane Craig gives, William Lane Craig taketh away. How do you reconcile that type of within the realm of classical apologetics? Are you comfortable with needing a principle of sufficient reason on the one hand? I know this isn't entirely related to Molinism, but I find these kind of price tag questions. What price tag are you willing to pay for something? Like, do you find it more beneficial to undermine or have a very weak principle of sufficient reason that would not suffice for a kalam, and give up kalam, or do you think the kalam is more beneficial and maybe say, okay, well, I may have this grounding issue within Molinism that we have to rework?
Yeah, so I think I would kind of take a moderate principle of sufficient reason. And it's precisely the one that William Lane Craig would give in his contingency argument, right? So that is kind of moderate, right? Because it's not talking about do facts need explanation? What's a sufficient explanation? And pertinent to libertarian free will, does there have to be a contrastive explanation or not? Obviously, Alexander Proust argues no, it can be sufficient without needing that. But so I would take kind of things that exist. They need a sufficient explanation, either in their own internal necessity or in an external cause. And to my mind, William Lane Craig's thing is even weaker. It's a causal principle based on the principle of sufficient reason, where it's talking about specifically things that begin to exist need an external cause. So that's even weaker than the moderate version of PSR that I would use.
Okay. Well, I love having a Molinist in the hot seat because I have so many questions, but you wouldn't have a question. So, what's your question with me? And then maybe at this point, David, you can jump in with a question or two, and then we'll go back to putting Dale in the hot seat. We'll give you a breather though for a minute.
All right, cool. So here's the thing that I want to ask you, because with this randomness objection, I get that this is kind of the Achilles heel for libertarian free wills. I think we just have to kind of bite the bullet and say, well, that's just how an actualized will works in terms of categorical abilities. Now, here's what I want to ask you, because you believe in God and you don't take a libertarian free will perspective, but you do say God has a categorical ability. So how does God avoid this randomness objection too? Wouldn't he have, like, what is it that explains why he chooses to create versus not?
Yeah. So a couple different things. So I am still a classical theist. Sort of. There are some areas where I'm finding there are some issues around the peripheral, specifically when it comes to morality. And it's largely because conceptually and categorically, I'm not sure exactly what it means to say that God is good or moral for an ase non-contingent being. So that doesn't mean that God is therefore bad. I'm just saying that those categories might not fit comfortably when we're talking about God. And by the way, there is tradition of this in Christian theology as well. You can see like Glenn Peoples and some others have done some work on the non-moral goodness of God, where God's goodness may actually be entirely consequentialist, whereas ours is not, because we just are different types of subjects and agents. Which that's an aside. So here's the thing. There are a lot of people who say, oh, well, I don't think humans, have libertarian freedom, but I think God has libertarian freedom. I think that's a very messy way to say it, because libertarianism is specifically an incompatibilist position. So if you think of libertarianism, it's a subcategory of this larger category called incompatibilism, which is this view that any type of determinism is in principle incompatible with any type of freedom that's necessary for responsibility, right? So it doesn't matter how it's determined. If anything is determined in any way whatsoever, you cannot have freedom that's necessary for responsibility. That's the incompatibilist position. What happens then is some people say, oh, well, I'm an incompatibilist, but sometimes, acts can be determined and we're free. But what they actually mean is I'm an indeterminist broadly, but I think some acts can be determined and free. they're a type of compatibilist, right? So compatibilism just says that they're not, that some being determined and being free, necessary for responsibility, are not in principle. They're not Mary Bachelor. They're not necessarily contradictory. That's all that it means. If you have, this is why, for years I've been saying, if I can come up with one example of something being determined and the agent being responsible, which I think I've done a lot of, compatibilism is just necessarily true. And therefore any species of incompatibilism is necessarily false, because they're going to rely on this principle of incompatibility, right? Incompatibilism is a very fragile position because one exception and it's necessarily false. And I think that, at least from the Bible, for Christians, I think I've shown you ought to be a compatibilist, but therefore you ought not to be a libertarian. I'm sure we'll get into that, later in this episode. When it comes to God, though, I don't think, again, because I'm not an incompatibilist, so God doesn't have libertarian freedom. I think that God has absolute autonomy, and so that there are no external constraints that are determinative of him. But God's nature may be determinative of his action. So I don't have a problem saying that God is not free to do things that are contrary to his own nature, right? Because it's like the Euthyphro, where they say, oh, well, God, if you split the horn of the Euthyphro, right, from it's either arbitrary or it's external, you say, well, no, it's entirely by his nature. And they say, oh, well, you're saying God is constrained by his nature. Sure, I don't find that that's not a constraint to be constrained by yourself, by your own nature. That's not I don't have an issue with that. So I would say that. And then there also is an answer I haven't done a lot of work on, so I'm just going to state it, but please don't press too hard because I haven't thought about it that much. You can press. And that is that under actus purus, where God's actions and nature are the same thing, it might not make sense to ask about the difference between what causes his actions internally and his nature, if those just are one and the same thing.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. Okay. So but just for the sake of argument, let's say they are separate kind of thing, just because
by predication analogy, we can talk about them separately. I just ontologically, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that so far. So.
Okay. So, so that makes sense. That's, believe it or not, there was an atheist named Val back on our Skeptics and Seekers when I first started, and that's kind of what I said as well. Like I believe that, okay, well, I guess God's determined by his nature, and that's why it's impossible. God can't lie, he can't sin and stuff like that. Obviously now I think I've modified. No, I think that it's strictly logically possible. There is a logically possible world where God can lie and can sin and can do these things. But then I make that distinction. Well, there's no feasible world, given the influences of his morally perfect nature and that sort of thing. His actualized will never choose to do it. So
would you say then, and sorry, just on this one point, then I think you finish your question, then David can jump in. Sure. Would you say that actually unfeasible worlds just are logically impossible worlds? They're a state where, because like I think of that, and I think I know you well enough to say you would affirm impeccability, right? Divine impeccability. God cannot do evil, for example. So there may be a logically possible. It's weird to talk about because I'm gonna actually say this is an incoherent statement. Given as a classical theist, I would say this is an incoherent statement, right? So it's to say there's a logically possible world where God has the power to do something, but for some reason on his nature, he can't actually do that thing. But really what that means is you're saying that it's not logic. God can't do a not God thing, right? X can't be not X. So really at the end of the day, these non-feasible worlds are actually not logically possible worlds. You just have to go through a couple steps to show why that is the case.
Yeah, like obviously, that's why Alvin Plantinga would say strictly logical possibility, whereby the contradiction is explicit, A and not A. Whereas these feasible or metaphysical worlds, again, why are they impossible? Because there are contradictions, but you have to spell it out. Now, the basis of the contradiction isn't necessarily what the line of argumentation you were giving, although I might go along with that as well. I need to think about it, but it's more that it's God's actualized will that creates that fact that it's impossible. He won't ever choose to do that. So that's kind of the basis of the contradiction there, rather than saying, well, if he does sin, then he's no longer God, and that's impossible or something like that. Okay, and here's my last question for you before we go to David. So here's what I wanted to understand. So if you're correct and God is determined by his own internal nature, and obviously, I'll say he has no external influences, nothing like that, how can he still be said to have a categorical ability? Because his nature is determining he's got one option. He's got to create, or he's got to not create, or whatever he does, kind of thing.
Yeah. So I would say that the categories are helpful of power of contradiction and power of contrariety, right? So it may not be the case that God is determined to create or not create. There may be options where God can't do X or not X, because doing one of them would be contrary to his nature somehow, right? But that doesn't mean that there are not multiple options that are available to God, such that God could act in contrariety, right? I think this is important especially when theists and atheists are talking, because a lot of times, especially when you're talking to like some presuppositionalists, they're going to say, oh, well, it's this impossibility contrary is either God or not God. And they lump all these other categories into not God. Technically, that's true. So, God could have created, let's say it's God could have created world W1 or W2 or W3 or W4, but he couldn't have created W5, right? We could say, God could create W1 or not W1, because he could create 2, 3, or 4. But really, that's a kind of a range of options, of good possible options. So you have contrariety there, not contradiction. So it's not he could create or not create. Maybe his nature requires that he creates, but he has this range of options to create. There's nothing external determining him, and it's still by his good pleasure, however you want to define what that is, that he could choose to create.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I'll let you go to David now. So yeah, thanks for your answer on that. That's interesting.
Okay, I am here. I'm afraid that I'm going to have to cut out early after this.
Sorry.
I took my night meds.
I bored you to death, eh?
Well, no, and I'm gonna really enjoy listening.
Just to sleep, not to death.
Yeah. So I can't fight it, cause meds. But that said, I can't really fully engage in the very high level philosophical debate that you're having. I think I would enjoy that, and Dale and I have attempted to do that before. But what I wanted to bring to the table was the skeptic perspective of why Molinism doesn't work. So this is not a Molinism defeater. You're free to go on thinking that Molinism works. But you were also delusional if you think that it is effective. So there's a difference between something being philosophically sound and actually useful. And so Molinism could be philosophically sound. I can't wait to see how this discussion ends. I don't think it is, but it could be. But it's irrelevant in the real world. And so I just wanted to bring a little bit of that real world perspective. Is that okay with everybody? Because I know it's a little bit different, a little bit different take. I'm the only actual non-God believer on the panel, which is weird. So here's the problem. Everything that Dale, everything that you've said about the nature of God is just stuff that claims that maybe you get out of a book, maybe out of some theological text, maybe out of your own headcanon, because not all of that is in fact written in the book. And so the first problem, never mind proving that there's a God. It's proving that the things that you are very confident about this God, and there is almost never any proof of that sort of thing. And I don't think that Tyler's going to, question you because, Tyler's talking theologically, about this God of the Bible and God of the philosophers. But an outsider is listening to this thinking, look, neither one of you knows jack about an actual God, if an actual God exists. And you have to ground that in something before talk of Molinism would have a chance. But the other problem with Molinism from, a practical perspective, most atheists that I know, in fact, were Christians at one point. So we've heard the stories. We know the stories. It does no good to say, trust God. Because at the end of the day, Molinism is kind of a theodicy. To get God out of the hot water of the mess that we're in now. God has a reason. God has a plan. God knows what's going to happen next. Trust God. Now, that's an interesting pitch, but you have to give us a reason to trust God. It cannot be a philosophical argument. That doesn't get us to trusting God. It cannot be a theological argument. It cannot be passages from a story. It cannot be, some logical puzzle that would fit together. You have to give me a reason to trust that God knows what he's doing, that God has a plan, and it's a good plan. I mean, you can read in the book that God made some to be, in Romans 9, the way I put this, God made some to be flower pots, and he made others to be chamber pots, vessels of destruction. So God has a good plan, but maybe his good plan is that I'm a vessel of destruction. Okay, screw that plan. Don't like it. Doesn't do anything for me. Trust God. What about all of the people who have trusted God, but who have ended up dying a bad death and disappointment and disillusionment? Trust God. I know the stories, and I know this God who interacted so much and so well with people to get them to trust him. They didn't trust him based on a story. They trusted him based on his mighty deeds. And so God may have given those people, let's just assume those stories are true history, may have given those people reason to trust him. But he hasn't given it to me. He hasn't given it to those of us who, when we're having a discussion, and then the Molinistic argument comes up, and at the end of the day, that breaks down to, you got to trust him. You got to give us a reason to trust him. And it seems that Christianity cannot do that. And so the next words you're going to say are going to be things about philosophy that most of us cannot understand, or stories which we can understand but do not accept as reasons to trust. And so at the end of the day, no matter which one of you beats each other to death philosophically, you will never come up with a reason, practically speaking, for the outsider to buy into the idea that God is not culpable for issues and that we should trust him and his good plan because he knows what's going to come next. I haven't seen any evidence for that, and I can't imagine any evidence that would come from that. And I think that I speak for most skeptics on this subject. So normally I would argue the kinds of philosophical things, Tyler, that you're arguing now, and I think that's a lot of fun. But at the end of the day, I hope that you two get around to talking about the practical side of this, because there is a reason people aren't flocking to Christianity on the basis of Molinism. In fact, that defeater doesn't defeat anything except good conversation. That's me.
Yeah, I appreciate all that. Thank you very much. So there's a lot that you said that I agree with. I mean, there's a reason why I apostatized. There's a reason why I left. There's a reason why that I have been making the arguments that I've been making basically to that effect of, from divine hiddenness and problem of evil and problem of suffering. And, if God did desire to have that type of relationship, he could have easily done so and hasn't. And so I think that I'm warranted and have reason to not. And as a kind of a bare theist, I don't even know what it means. I don't trust in God because that's not a thing anymore, right? I kind of look at God in the same way. I don't think Hamlet has to trust in Shakespeare, outside of the simple fact that Shakespeare just created the world that Hamlet lived in. And a story played out that way. So I wouldn't actually be appealing to you, David, to trust in God. I'm perfectly happy for you to live and die as an atheist. I don't think that there is much writing on it, outside of simply do we I think it just is plausibly true that there is this kind of ultimate explanation for certain things and why I hold those things. I agree with you that Molinism wouldn't prove much to unbelievers, and then I'll let Dan answer. This will be my last comment about this. Although the way that I understood Molinism is it's not actually kind of a front-facing apologetic, right? It's actually almost, and historically, I know this is not how it came about with Molina and everything, but the way it has kind of had this resurgence in Molinism is actually formulated largely as a set of defeaters. It's not one thing. It's actually kind of this series or sets of responses that are defeaters, right? Their value is when someone actually does make these philosophical objections to evil, to suffering, kind of logical versions, not existential versions, not evidential versions, but these logical problems. And these logical problems of saying, hey, you, Mr. Christian, you say that God is all knowing. And so now you have these, and then they present these providence problems, or you have determinists like myself who are going to, as far as I understand, David, I think you're a deterministic incompatibilist. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but even if you aren't, people that are deterministic incompatibilists are going to propose these problems. And so what the Molinists is doing is they're taking those objections and they're saying, okay, well, I now have a rejoinder for those defeaters. I have a defeater for those defeaters, right? Now you might come along and say, okay, well, I have a defeater, and say that really the problem is that this type of philosophical, once you're that far downstream, it's so far in the philosophical weeds that in kind of in business or I think it's in processing terms, the feasibility range of it, if its utility versus its complexity has just exceeded its bounds and it's now, bursting its borders. And so you should back up. It's kind of like the ontological argument, right? So maybe it has this philosophical value, but it's so opaque and so obtuse, and it doesn't scratch where the objection actually itches, that it may actually end up looking more like a put-up job and a bunch of ad hoc assertions and stuff like that, that it may have kind of negative cash value with how complicated it needs to be to try to overcome these objections as a defeater. So I don't know if that, Dale, if that kind of is how you would understand it, or if you wanted to address that differently.
Yeah. So the thing, a lot of things kind of struck me that David was saying, right? So the first thing is, look, I mean, you say that you're not interested in philosophical arguments, but you are when it suits you. Like, and I mean, Tyler is well known for leaving the faith. Why? Because of a philosophical argument. A hiddenness of God argument is one of his main reasons. That's a philosophical argument. It may not be the same as. It may not be. What?
It's also a practical argument. So yeah, it's couched in philosophy and theology, but it's also practical. I cried out for God and he wasn't there. That's a practical argument.
Well, I mean, I cried out to God and he gave me Molinism. That practically saved my life. So what are you saying? How are philosophical arguments for God or defending God not practical in the same way that a philosophical argument against God existence is?
What I'm saying is the example you gave of the hiddenness argument, okay. I don't necessarily think of it as a philosophical argument. It can be, but I think of it more as a practical argument than a philosophical argument. If you want to couch everything in terms of philosophy. That's possible. You can, but that's not how most of the world
But,
thinks. And I
but
don't think that I don't think that's those reasons are why most people walk away. They're very practical arguments. Now, there are theological arguments too. There are any number of arguments, but I'm just saying that if all you have to defend God is another piece of philosophy that doesn't touch the practical issue, then I'm sorry, that's not going to be
so,
effective to
so
the vast majority of people.
I think if I can maybe bridge the gap, Dale, and David, correct me if I'm wrong. I think what David is saying is you might have these kind of existential or personal reasons for not believing, and when you come into kind of the spheres that we like to play in a philosophical discourse, they get kind of a philosophical veneer to them. We're discussing about the philosophical because we want to be able to respond to someone who says, "Oh, you're being emotional." I'm going to say, "Well, no, there's logical reasons why we should think this." Now we start going, you love Bayes. I don't actually like Bayes, but kind of in Bayesian terms, we start thinking, well, if God exists, this type of thing this shouldn't be the outcome. We shouldn't observe. What should we expect to observe if there is a God and all that kinds of? We can go into these philosophical things, but I think David's point, we probably won't. We probably won't scratch where David itches for the most of the show because we are going to be having these philosophical discussions. But I think his point is valid, which is that for most people, belief in God, trust in God is experiential and existential, right? And so is unbelief. So is unbelief or disbelief, right? However you want to cash that out. It does have this experiential side where I'm going to come along and say, look, even if you could, so Dale, I'll tell you flat out, even if you could convince me that Molinism was coherent, right? Because I'll tell you, I flat out think Molinism is incoherent on numerous levels. I don't even think it's logically possible because I think there's too many incoherences.
So do I, by the way, which is why I'm not. Which is why I didn't bring a philosophical argument. I knew that you guys would have that covered.
But even if you could convince me that let's say you could convince me that it's not only coherent, but it is the best understanding of the Bible systematically, right? I'm still going to come back to exactly what David said, which is sure, but at the end of the day, if God is love and if God is a loving Father, I think I'm reasonable to expect that there is a certain type of interaction that I would have. And if God doesn't have that, then at the end of the day, God doesn't want me to be in that relationship because it would be trivially easy. And I know David agrees with me. It would be I'm not a hardened skeptic. I'm not out there like I don't hate God. I'm still a theist. I don't hate Jesus. I'd be totally happy if it's true. And it would be very, very trivially easy for God to convince me. And not in kind of a he has to be my butler type of way. It would be very, 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 very easy, especially for an omnipotent being, to convince me that Christianity specifically is true. And I would happily put my faith and trust back in Jesus Christ again. The fact that doesn't happen is more, I think what David is getting at is just existentially, that's more telling. And so you could do all this kind of philosophizing, but it's going to be a drop in the bucket compared to what, like I would look at it and I would say, okay, well, if evangelism for the one true religion is true, well, why wouldn't we expect to see more healings upon evangelism and prayer and revival, right? Why wouldn't we expect to see those things and we don't? You have this larger existential burden. And so at the end of the day, the more philosophically in the weeds you have to go, it can actually kind of have this negative, it can almost have like an icky feeling to people like David and I still love the philosophy, so I don't actually feel that icky, but it can have this kind of like icky feeling where we're like, okay, but like you could write me this like philosophical dissertation on why, I have this heavenly Father, but it really feels like an absentee, abusive relationship. So no matter how philosophically robust that is, I'm still over here experiencing the short end of the stick. If that makes sense.
Yeah. So no, look, gentlemen, I'm gonna go ahead and I want to beg
You
off
don't
right
know
now.
my answer. Okay, no, you're tired.
No,
No.
I do. Yeah, no, I'm
Just
Listen,
deterministically knock that domino
yeah.
down for us to have this conversation.
Yeah, but you guys shoot me a link when this is done because I am anxious to see how it goes. Thanks for having me, and I meant to not take my night medicine, but I forgot and I took it by force of habit, and yeah, it's doing what it's doing. So thanks again, Tyler. Thanks again, uh, Dale, and
remember me, Dale.
yeah.
All right, cool. Have a good night, David.
Have a
And
good night.
so yeah, so the thing I wanted to say, kind of thing is, look, again, you guys are using intellectual arguments. You guys are making a modus. Every hiddenness of God, problem of evil, they have the same modus tollens basic structure, right? Where you guys are saying, if God exists, we would expect this, and guess what? It's a fact that we don't have this as your evidential premise. Therefore, God doesn't work and doesn't exist, or something like that. And I think we have to remember the burden of proof is on you as the skeptic. I don't have to prove to you. You have to prove to me that, well, look, mate, God is at fault. Is it actually true that if God exists, there wouldn't be people that lack these experiences or lack these things? For you, for example, you believe, as a Christian, you were a Calvinist, right? And you still believe that the Bible, the Calvinist position, is the true biblical position. So, or no? Oh, okay.
So, kind of. I still think that. Well, I don't know if we want to go down this rabbit trail. Very, 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 very in short, I don't think there is a way to have a single systematic understanding of the Bible, because I think there are just too many contradictory passages. I think Reformed, not just because I was never a tuliper, right? I was Reformed, classical, covenantal, right? I think that system is the most robust and coherent of the attempts to systematize the Bible, but I don't think that there is a systematic of the Bible, if that makes sense.
Okay. So
I think that's the systematic approach that has the least problems with biblical passages.
Gotcha. Okay, so if you don't mind, this is just a very quick side question that I've always wanted to ask you, because on this basis, you've kind of, on the basis of your lack of experiences and gaining the fruits of the Spirit, the Bible makes certain predictions that, if true, a true Christian should show. Now, obviously, as a Calvinist, you believed in the Reformed classical thing. You believed in the elect, right? So some people were determined to be saved, others weren't. Why did you conclude? I know you have other reasons, but on that basis, why wouldn't you just go, well, I guess I'm not elect, as opposed to saying, well, Christianity must be false?
Yeah. Well, you have to remember that. I talk about hiddenness and problems of suffering a lot now. But I talked about this in the last couple of my episodes, that hiddenness was actually the kind of final straw, right? So actually, the intellectual problem started with all of the theological, biblical, cultural issues with the Bible itself, right? So these issues of the contrast between kind of God of classical theism and omnimax God, and what we see in the Bible, which seems to be and Yahweh is in some ways hard to distinguish from Baal and Ashtaroth in some ways, and there are I think biblical contradictions. There are issues with the text right there. So there are lots of other intellectual problems I had. What happened was, and this may be actually I may platform for a minute here, because this has been a common response people have given me, Tyler lied about being a Christian for so long. Well, no, because I had intellectual doubts for about a year or so, about a year and a half. I was having I had intellectual problems, but I was still committed to Christianity. I was still placing my trust in Jesus. I was still committed to I was thinking this could be a dark night of the soul. Still researching, trying to understand. I wasn't going to, in kind of the Psalm 73 sense, if I spoke thusly, I would betray your people, right? I was still trying to stay committed. There was a certain point where because I understand biblical faith. I think this is kind of the coherent. Biblical faith is not actually an intellectual thing; it's a volitional thing in the Bible, right? It is a level of commitment and trust. So I was still by faith and by profession a Christian. I was still believing it was true as a system, even though I thought it had some truth problems, and I was trying to work it out. So it was not actually until the very end where I was like, this is just, now I have this existential problem where not only am I having these intellectual issues, and I think there's contradictions, and I'm seeing all these problems, and I'm not getting answers to these, and I'm, my credence for that is going down and down and down. But now also, I'm staying committed. I'm going to church. I'm doing scripture memory. I'm praying, and I'm doing all these things. Not saying that therefore I deserve it, but in this Pascalian thing, I'm doing all the things for years that ought to be, attract to that relationship, right? That's the kind of the spiritual disciplines that a Christian relationship is built upon. Practically, not, I know a Christian relationship is built on, God's love and all that kind of stuff, but, and so at the end of the day, I was like, if I'm putting myself in this position, I'm putting myself, I'm seeking God where he may be found. I'm doing all the, all this kind of stuff. Again, not in a quid pro quo way, but God is still absent. When it would be trivially easy, it broke the final, the hiddenness broke the final resolve for me, is what it did. It's not why I actually came to think Christianity is false.
Okay.
So that's why I appreciate and I understand David's statement where he's like, look, you could do all these philosophical things, but at the end of the day, there still is this like crunchy existential problem of hiddenness or evil or suffering or whatever it is that Molinism just doesn't touch. And to that, I appreciate that to a degree, but then on the other side, we say, okay, but Molinism isn't that's not what it's designed to do. That's not its stated goal. It's not trying to scratch that existential itch. So, there may be some kind of discontinuity coming and going between the objection and what Molinism is and what Molinism is and that objection. So,
yeah, it's well, I guess I hear what you guys are saying. But I was trying to respond. The reason I asked you about that Calvinist thing is like, even with on the practical level, you do need to consider these defeaters. Don't call them defeaters if that's a technical term or whatever, but you can't just mindlessly put forward an argument and, well, I'm not experiencing this, therefore God doesn't exist. You need to kind of consider that. I gave the Calvinist defense. Did you consider it? Say I could give the Molinist defense. Did you at least consider? Well, maybe God's got reasons. Like, on a practical level, there is at least some responsibility that I think the person who's advancing an argument has to engage with, at least to the best of their abilities. And
and this is where I would go back and I actually realized I didn't answer your Calvinist question. I can answer that in a second. The part of me wants to just say, well, sure. I'm not sure. I'm actually not sure that these are deductive Molus Tollens arguments, right? I think hiddenness and some suffering are actually probably more abductive than anything else, right? You can set them up in a modus tollens fashion, but I think really it's just, what would we expect to find? What's the most plausible explanation for that? And in some cases, I would say, well, it is the most plausible explanation of the experience of hiddenness and gratuitous evil and or heinous evil, right? Because I think there are some ways to get around gratuitous evil, because to say it's gratuitous, you actually kind of have to pretend to have omniscience to know all the reasons why I got it right. So you can't actually say it's gratuitous. Right. So, but you could still say there's these heinous evils. Mm-hmm. And what would we, what background would we expect, right? And I don't expect it to be an all loving, omnimax, supreme heavenly Father in those cases. When I look at something that does not abductively. That's not a good abductive explanation for me. So I would actually treat a lot of these in an abductive manner, not a deductive manner. Back to the Calvinism question, I would say, well, I mean, I did consider those things, but at the end of the day, part of the issue was I just came to think that the scripture, right? I just came to think that the scripture was wrong, right? I didn't think that actually the God inspired truth. So this is why when Calvinists are going to say, well, Tyler left because he was never a true Christian. I give two responses to it. One of them is that's a wildly unreformed answer to say, right? There's kind of this tulip only Calvinism. Yeah. Reformed theology would say, well, you can only actually know someone is a reprobate if they fully and finally fall away. That is up until their deathbed, because you don't actually know that someone has apostatized, if someone has fully and finally apostatized until they die, right?
Mm.
So it's weird to say someone who is alive is a reprobate. That's thoroughly unreformed. Weirdly enough, when Reformed people say it, I would say, why do I take your tradition more seriously than you do? So first of all, Reformed people should just stop saying that, because that's, if you read any of your confessions, that is not the response of the confessions towards apostates, and that's not what reprobation is. Because if there is a chance for someone to return, they're not a reprobate yet. If someone's a reprobate, they're a reprobate eternally, but you can't know that they're a reprobate or not.
Yeah.
But the flip side is to say, I also understand when people say, oh, well, you've fallen away, so therefore we have to think that you are not among us. And I'm going to say, okay, I understand that internal to your system, that's the consistent response. I don't find that condescending. I think that is the consistent response from within your theology. I get it. I don't think that the Bible is the word of God or inspired. I don't think there is such a thing as election. So I'm not personally worried about it, but I get that that's the consistent response from you all. It's fine. I know some people who leave are like very offended by people saying, oh, well, then you were never a true Christian, because they think it means you were never sincere. But the Reformed person or the I mean, even Arminians and people who hold to eternal security would say, it's not a Calvinist only answer, by the way. They're going to say, well, we think that you were never a true Christian. They're not saying that you weren't personally sincere. They're going to say you weren't ontologically you weren't justified. You can't get unjustified.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to say, I mean, fine. Cool. You think that I was never justified, and that's consistent with your system. Fine.
Yeah, but I was, believe it or not, I won't reveal anything private, but I was talking to Tyler Vela about this kind of thing, because again, your experience, I was there. I believed I was a true Christian growing up until 2009, 2010, around there. And I sincerely disbelieved. I left the faith and stopped believing it was true. And now I've come back to it. So I can't deny that happens, because it happened to me. I have firsthand experience of it. Let me just know what your thoughts are on this. This is one person, Tyler Vela, came up with this that I thought was an interesting and perhaps correct answer. So I'm interested in your thoughts. But he was saying that, well, in my terminology, I remained a real seeker. It's not like when I left, I ever truly disbelieved or like committed to rejecting Jesus. I just had, look, I have doubts. I don't believe this, but I'm willing to believe it if I get that evidence. So it was kind of more, apostates are more people that actually, no, I'm actively disbelieving this and I reject it. Whereas I was just, well, I want to believe the truth, but I don't know that this is true, so I'm not following it until I get that. I don't know if you think that works.
Yeah, somewhat. I think there may be somewhere in the middle, right? Because I mean, I reject it. I think there's good reason to think that it's false. But one of the reasons why I really enjoy discussing these, I mean, I enjoy discussing this for all kinds of reasons. One of the things that does annoy me is when people are like, oh, well, you left. Why do you still talk? Why do you even still care to talk about theology? And I'm like, that's the one that I'm like, well, that is condescending. And I am interested in truth. I am interested in discussing these things. And if I'm wrong, I would love to be wrong. I want to continue seeking the truth, because that is what's important to me. I think that there is now evidence to think that this is false, but I still find it interesting and helpful, and it's a beneficial discussion. And if someone could show that I'm wrong, I would love to know that I'm wrong. I think that I'm still a real seeker. I think I'm still seeking, but I'm not seeking. I'm seeking the truth, whatever that is. I'm not seeking Jesus, for example. Now, in good classical Christian form, they might say, well, Jesus is the truth. So without knowing, you're seeking Jesus. And there are some universalists, and there are some other Christian positions that are going to say, well, when you're actually talking about salvation, there is a sense where someone actually could deny Jesus but still be saved, because they are seeking Jesus. They just don't know that they are. It's kind of the Christ plays in 10,000 places kind of answer. And so that you get some interesting answers in that direction as well. So I think it's interesting.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with what you said, right? Like being a real seeker doesn't mean, well, I'm just really seeking Christianity. You're seeking the truth, whatever it is, right? And I didn't just study Christianity as well. So yeah, I totally get what you're saying. Okay. The other thing about David's thing, I also wanted to admit, look, there are claims on the other side, right? If I were trying to claim, no, when I use my Molinistic defeater, I'm using it not as a theodicy, but as a defeater. And I actually tried to put premises to it. So at one point, do you mind if I share my screen and just kind of get your opinion on the premises?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. But before I get to that, I do want to admit, on the other side, if a Christian is making a positive claim and saying Molinism is true, then they have the burden of proof, right? If you're making a theodicy which carries a burden of proof, then you have to establish the truth of your reasoning, however you do that, philosophically or practically, whatever you do, right? So I totally admit that. And so I put into premises, okay, present. All right, so this is on a more, but I'm just sort of interested in your, oops. Hang on.
You let me know when you're ready for me to add it.
Okay.
I got your email up real quick. Sorry, I took it down as fast as I could. So.
No, yeah, that's okay. People have seen it before, but yeah, that's really, really small. Is there any way to? If it opens up, I tried to put it in premise format. Now, again, remember, this is in it as a defeater. So it's a defeater to the problem of evil. And it's meant as an undercutting. Why didn't that work? Meant as an undercutting defeater. So I don't have a burden of proof. I'm just trying to undercut your justification or warrant for believing it's true. So. Okay, accept. Son of a gun. Okay, never mind. I'll just read it to you then. How about that? So, sorry about that. Okay, so premise one then is that God, as understood under the Molinistic defeater, is minimally omniscient, omnipotent, and morally perfect.
Are you able to? Sorry, are you able to like?
Download it or something?
Like copy and paste it into the comment. I'm trying to figure out the best way to do this. Or if you send it on the email real fast, I can throw it up on the slide, and then it won't be as pretty because I won't have it all prettyified. But
no worries. Hang on. Let me just send that to your email right now. Sorry about this, by the way. But yeah, I would like to get, because I did an entire debate with Dr. David Campbell Cook, who's an open theist, but he challenged me to put some actual premises on this thing. Desktop. Oh, son of a gun. Okay, so yeah, I only have it. Remember, I said I had internet issues, so maybe I can just forward it to you. Tyler Vela. All right, so I've just forwarded it to you. Let me know if you got the slides or not.
have like hold music for the people that are
like elevator music or something. Sorry about this, everyone, but video.
I got a Word document. It looks like this is your note. This is your notes on my video, I think.
Okay. There's no way to forward a prior email in that same thread because that's where my slides are. I don't have it on my desktop.
I don't think so.
Okay. Okay. You know what? Never mind. We can just skip that then. So, yeah. Cool.
Well, no, just read through it. I'm going to type as I go. So just.
Okay. Okay. So
forgive me if.
So premise one is just kind of defining who God is and labeling basically the attributes that are relevant for the problem of evil argument. So he's minimally an omniscient, omnipotent, and morally perfect being. And premise 2, if God is omniscient, then he has knowledge, minimally has knowledge of all true propositions. Therefore, God minimally has knowledge of all true propositions. That's just straightforward. Premise 4. This is the factual premise I'm saying, and there are true propositions that correspond to counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. There are true propositions talking about what I would will to do, or will to refrain from doing certain things in certain circumstances. Okay. And there are specifically counterfactuals of creaturely freedom related specifically to the biblical requirements of salvation. Okay.
Got a separate premise after the...
That's part of 4, yeah. So part of premise 4 is I'm specifying specific types of counterfactuals exist related to salvation. Okay. Therefore, God knows all true propositions corresponding to counterfactuals of creaturely freedom related to the biblical requirements for salvation. So, okay. Premise 6, only God has the power to actualize any metaphysical God has the power to actualize any metaphysically possible states of affairs. Okay. And then just by logical equivalence, therefore, God lacks the power to actualize any metaphysically impossible states of affairs. And we're almost done, just 3 more. 8, it is metaphysically impossible for God to actualize a state of affairs where no and or a different amount of evil actualizes, whereby the same or higher number of free creatures will to fulfill the biblical requirements for salvation.
So the second half again.
This
is possible where no and or different amount of evil actualizes,
and whereby the same or a higher number of free creatures over time choose or will to fulfill the biblical requirements for salvation relative to our actual world. Okay. And then last premise. God has the ultimate desire that as many free creatures over time as is metaphysically possible, freely choose to fulfill the biblical requirements for salvation. This is obviously on the assumption of the
God has the ultimate desire to create the maximum.
As many free creatures as is metaphysically possible to freely choose to fulfill the biblical requirements for salvation. And then finally, conclusion. Therefore, God would either lack the power or ultimate desire to actualize another world whereby evil or a different amount of evil does not actualize in precisely the way it has in the actual world.
Sorry, say that one again.
Therefore, God would either lack the power or the ultimate desire to actualize another world whereby evil instantiates, evil does not actualize in precisely the way it does in our world, in the actual world.
Somewhat shorthand. This is admittedly not word for word but I think it's the spirit of what you were going for.
Mhm.
That's a little hard to read, but we'll try it out.
No problem. And
so here is, so I've share screen.
And this is something I came up with and on the spot on a show in like 5 minutes or 10 minutes or so. So
yeah. So sorry, I branded it.
cool.
So that's all I had readily available. So I have a couple different. So what? I guess I'm trying to go through some of my questions here. So my first thought again is, and I think you readily admit this, is if you wanted to make this a defensible argument, you'd have a lot of validity cleaning up to do.
Yeah.
Right. So as it stands, I don't think it's valid for several different reasons we don't need to go into. But I get that you're trying, it's somewhat imprecise. You're not trying to create your right. So we can go with the spirit of the premises and not say, okay, is it tightly logically valid and all that kind of stuff, right? So
yeah.
I guess a couple of questions that I would have. I don't know how this entails Molinism, right? Because remember, under the Augustinian or the classical view, number 4 could still be rooted in God's decrees, right? So remember, I gave an example that we could ground exhaustive counterfactuals in God decrees, whereby God could know if I were, kind of this counterfactual of his natural knowledge. If I were to decree X, to choose Y, then X would choose Y, right? And you could even add freely, right? Because without begging the question of incompatibilism, right? The compatibilist could say, God can know if I decree, John to freely choose X, then John will freely choose X, right? And without begging the question of incompatibilism, I'm not sure the Molinist or the Libertarian could protest to that.
Okay. It's a little bit weird though, I guess, right? Like it's still kind of, the decree is ultimately logically after the free will decision almost, right? Because it's not playing a determining role.
The decree would be prior to the. So this is where part of my metaphysical, we haven't really gotten to this, but part of my metaphysical problem with Molinism is that I think that agents are more free in the hypothetical middle knowledge than in the actual world, right? Because they have this libertarianly free choice, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of what they would choose given circumstances X, but all the options are just on the table. However, in the actual world, I think God's creative decree causally determines which set of actions will be true in the actual world. Right. So if you have, let's say you have feasible worlds 1, 2, and 3, right? Mm-hmm. God creates, weakly or not, he creates W2. Well, W2 just is a set of true propositions, right? God has determined that set of propositions will be true. So now the question becomes, if you doing X at T1, just know that I could do all the philosophical, you do X in context, whatever, we could do, let's just call it X for shorthand. You doing X is true in the actual world, right? And that's only true in W2. It's not true in any other possible world. God created W2. Given the fact that God created W2, is it metaphysically possible for you to not do X? That is it possible for W2 to be not W2?
I would say no, yeah. But
yeah,
but
I think that's what I'm saying. So I think in the actual, I think when you look at it that way, libertarianism only makes sense if it's metaphysically possible. That's what the categorical ability. You have the real metaphysical possibility to actualize X or not X. But given that God has created this world W2 in which you will do X, he's determined that it's W2, and it's not possible for W2 to not be W2, that's just law of identity, then it seems that while his middle knowledge is rooted in this libertarian free choice and this kind of hypothetical, in the actual world, you don't have libertarian free choice because God has predestined and determined that this is the actual world. And so your choice is actually not the subject of what was known in middle knowledge because you have a different type of freedom in the actual world than you do. So like it just gets so metaphysically,
but
I think incoherent.
It's not the decree that's taking away that, restricting that possibility. It's the actual will as that base level kind of explanation type thing.
I disagree.
It's our wills that are determining that we can only choose this one option.
So think of it in, I know this is somewhat a deterministic way to describe it, but God has a range of options he could create. He could create world 1, world 2, world 3, world 4.
Okay.
Let's say all the worlds are identical in every single way possible, except for they all end at T10, for example.
Okay.
They are identical up until T10. And the only difference at T10 is your free choice. You could choose A, B, C, or D, or I guess it's going to, let's do A or B or not A or not B, right?
Okay. Yeah. Like you can have an apple or refrain from eating an apple or have an orange.
Or banana or refrain from eating. Those are the only options.
Okay.
Right? Let's say those are the only feasible options, right?
Feasible option.
I know that's weird because like having a banana is the same as not having a not apple, but whatever. Okay, so let's not try to make this too overly, philosophical. God chooses to actualize W2, or let's say W3, where you eat the banana. You freely choose to eat the banana, right? World 1, 2, 3, and 4 are identical in every single proposition up until T10, where you make the choice.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
God determined that it would be W3, world 3, where you ate the banana. The only thing that's different in all of those worlds is the starting causal chain where God created W3. That creative decree to create world 3 does seem to be causally relevant to the outcome because the worlds are identical in every other way possible. And they're all equally feasible.
Well,
right? This isn't eating poop or not eating poop. Let's say you have kind of an equal desire for apples and bananas. You like them all. It's entirely within your world. And the context in which you're placed, the circumstances in which you're placed at T9 are identical. So it's not this, if I place Dale in context 1, he will choose X, because they're all the circumstances are causally identical up to that point.
So first of all, the difference or disanalogy there is you specified in your example, these are all 4 feasible worlds, right? And obviously that's not the case when we're talking about this free will kind of thing, because no, we're talking about there's 4 strictly logical possible worlds that God can create. And then
feasible. I meant feasible. They are all feasible worlds for God to create.
Well, then your example works, but it's just disanalogous to what I'm saying about free will then, because what I'm saying is that God has a set of logically possible worlds. And in terms of the smaller subset of what's feasible, it's based on our actualized will, right? So before our actualized will, we just have a bunch of potentials, right? Our potential will, as you want to call it, and God can talk about that. It's grounded in his causal power. But once that will is actualized, it becomes this prime mover, this special thing whereby it will just never will to do what is strictly logically possible in eating the banana as an option. So this
is where I'm going to go back though, and I'm going to say, okay, well, are you saying that your will on W3 was different than your will on W2? And if so, then what you're then I don't know how you're not a determinist, because then you're going to say, well, your will was set prior to creation when God created, and that was the thing that set your will. So you have then you're still stuck saying that it's the causal determinant was all these prior conditions. It was the nature of your will, right? So it's not it seems like in order to defend this libertarian sense, you have to run full stop into not liberty. You have to have these prior causal conditions that necessitate that it's going to be that outcome that's the only feasible outcome. Otherwise, it should be indeterminate, right? It should be, if libertarianism is true, it should be indeterminate, right? You shouldn't have this prior condition that causally necessitates that one outcome. Otherwise, you just are a determinist but calling it libertarian.
Yeah, it's indeterminate with respect to all other non-will factors, right? Those are everything that's the same. But so there is a difference between the wills, right? One's a potential will versus actualized will. Once that will is actualized, that makes all the difference. And that's why it's just infeasible. Well, given that will is actualized, it will never choose the not a option or the not banana
right,
option.
But this is where I'm pointing out though that then God actualizing that world, that will, that now is causally determinative of the outcome. Whatever world God chose to create, whatever world God chose to actualize with that specific will in it, it now cannot metaphysically be other than that. In the actual world, in the actual sequence of events, you don't have a categorical ability to do others, because now you just said, well, it's now not metaphysically possible for you to do otherwise. It is now set. You can only do this one thing, which I'm just to say, well, I don't think any libertarian means that by libertarian freedom. So in order to defend this libertarian scheme of Molinism, you've now had to defend it by, punting to a deterministic scheme, where now you don't have this metaphysically real ability to do categorically other than you do in the actual sequence, which just seems to be the sine qua non of libertarianism.
Well, yeah. So I think, again, it's because the actualized will is the thing doing the determining all by it's influenced by these external things, but it's the will itself is not determined. And I ground the categorical ability in the strict logical possibilities. That's good enough for me. So if that's unsatisfactory to Tim Stratton and stuff, that's fine. But I do think that our actualized will is what narrows the feasible world.
It narrows it. It doesn't determine it, right?
The will, I think, I would be fine saying that our will determines that. It's internally determined.
Does your will causally necessitate that one and only one outcome? Or in the actual sequence, in the actual world, do you have a categorical ability to actualize a metaphysically different thing than the thing you do in the actual world?
In the actual world, do we have the ability to bring about the metaphysically? No, I think in these sets of circumstances, there is only one feasible option, even though there is another strictly logical possibility of not A or not the banana. But it's again, that's not a problem for me, because it's our will that is narrow.
What determines what constitutes your will? That's a loaded question. What causally determined? I'm going to say it that bluntly. What causally determined that Dale is Dale and is not Dale?
You mean as a substance? Who I am? Like
as a substance, the makeup, all the things that are internal to you that constitute what it is you will.
Oh, well, my will is just a prime mover. Like that's the way it has to work, is that it's all of the other things, my nature, my character.
Did it begin to exist?
I'm sorry?
Did it begin to exist?
Did my will begin to exist? Yes, it did.
Well, okay. Let me back up, because we're getting into a lot of my. I'm actually going to remove this from the screen, because I think we're gonna move on from. But yeah, I mean, this is where I have a lot of issues with the anthropology of Molinism, and it falls into kind of that metaphysic, right? So will is almost reified as like a thing in itself in Molinism, right? Yeah. Whereas philosophically, will is just a faculty, right? So like I have no problem saying your will doesn't determine what you choose. Your will is the faculty by which you choose what you do, right? It just is. It's the chooser. It's the picker within your being, within your metaphysics, right? But I think the person, the agent, is the thing that's choosing to do it. It's just the will is the mechanism by which, it's the faculty by which we choose things.
Yeah.
On Molinism and on a lot of libertarian kind of anthropology, I'm glad you agreed, because it seems like the will is reified as this thing that chooses deterministically, indeterministically. Like, it's very, very bizarre. And so I'm gonna, that's one area where I push back. But if you're agreeing with me that the will isn't a thing, it's a faculty.
Yes.
Then I'm gonna push back and say, well, then the agent is the thing choosing.
Okay.
Right.
You're right.
And so then I'm gonna say, okay, well, all the attributes that constitute your agency, what caused those to be Dale?
So I think, so this kind of goes back to the Buddhist question, right? Like I think the I is what orients the will. Everything else can be transient. My nature can change. This is something, another thing I heard you say about anthropology, like the sin nature is contingent. That isn't an essential part of the human nature at all. I mean, Adam and Eve had it before the fall, right? They didn't have it before the fall. They changed and acquired a sin nature. Jesus had a full human nature. He didn't have a sin nature at all. He never sinned and stuff like that. So I don't think that the sin nature is an essential aspect. I forget why was I getting into that? Yes. Our characters, our personality traits, none of these are essential to who my individual essence is, Dale. I just think What is your, so this is where I know what you're referring to, because this is where I find Molinism to get even, it gets bizarre. It gets weird when you start getting into like transworld depravity. It starts coming off as like, there's these like tabula rasa souls sitting in a soul bank somewhere. And so God knows that this one soul is transworld, damned. And so no possible world that you put this soul into will it ever believe. And so he could put all those ones over in Mayan culture. Mm-hmm. And part of me wants to go back and be like, not only is that just weird, because I think what is, yes, my human nature is whatever human is human, but whatever makes Tyler seems wildly contingent on circumstances, genes, heredity, upbringing, there's all these kind of things that make me. I don't know what it means to say that you could take my soul and uplift me and put me in 2nd century China, and I would have similar belief forming faculties. But then at that point, I'm going to say, okay, well, if you want to claim that, which seems weird, and I would say, I think, I know how this sounds coming from someone who no longer believes the Bible, wildly unbiblical. I do not think that that's the biblical anthropology at all. But I also it just pushes the problem down the road, because then I'm going to say, okay, but what determined the nature of these transworld damned? I'm just going to use transworld damned as a clear example. What determined that the nature of this transworld damned being would be transworld? It's transworld damned for a reason, because it has certain, or it will actualize wants or desires or whatever in any context such that it won't believe. But that's, if I ask why, you're going to give some type of substantive answer about its being. But then I'm going to say, okay, well, why is its being that way? Well, because God determined that to create that thing that way, right? So I don't know that kind of answer gets what Molinists think that it does, rather than just kind of punting it one more step. It's like when compatibilists ask incompatibilists why you chose to eat cereal. Mm-hmm. Eventually you're any attempt to answer why just is going to be a causal explanation. And if you get to a point where you just kind of have this brute answer, all of us are just going to find it wildly unsatisfactory. You say, well, I just chose it because I chose it, and it's entirely indeterministic. That just opens up a whole other can of worms. Does that kind of make sense? I know it's a little scattered. Kind of. Let me just ask just a quick clarification question. Do you go for transworld identity or not?
I don't think transworld is a meaningful category.
Okay.
Okay. Because I don't know what it means to say, like I said, I don't know what it means to say that you could just pick me up and drop me in 2nd century Chinese culture, and somehow I would be the same thing. I think you'd be fundamentally a different thing.
Gotcha. Okay. So there's a kind of a difference then, because I do think that we're not property things, or I don't go for the bundle theory of substance. I kind of go for the classical understanding, this individual essence. We are a substance, and we remain united in the same thing despite change and that sort of thing. So that would, yes, that would be you. There's this center of self-consciousness that is transported, even if you have an entirely, I think that a soul can't just exist tabula rasa, like you said. It has to exemplify and have certain faculties. But what I'm saying, it's not just because I at time one have these personalities or I have this nature, those specific things aren't necessary to one's essence, kind of thing. They have to exemplify some kind of nature and some kind of personality and stuff, right? But not those.
So then I guess I would ask them, because it seems like there's a potentially infinite amount of ways that God could create beings, right?
Okay.
But then at that point, because then I'm gonna go back to this then.
Okay.
It's metaphysically impossible where no and or different amount of evil actualizes, right? All that, 8.
Yeah.
8 and 9. It just seems, again, I know this is a seem thing, but I don't know how you get it, because it seems to give the answer for like transworld damned, or when you said it that way, where you could pick up people and move them around like that way, and kind of as temporal pawns, temporal and contextual pawns, you could just kind of move them from context to context.
Mm-hmm.
It seems that there's a nearly infinite number of trans world damned beings, but then also it seems that there would be a potentially infinite number of trans world righteous beings that under any context given they would believe,
Okay.
right? Or it'd be trivially easy to make them believe. And so then I would say, okay, but then I have no reason to accept a bunch of these premises, right? So once we have this kind of movable anthropology, now it just seems, well then God should be able to populate a cosmos with, nearly an infinite number of more free creatures that actually believe and meet the biblical requirements, because there's a potentially infinite number of trans world righteous beings, right? We know there's a bunch of them. Well, we don't know because I don't believe the Bible. But there's a bunch of trans world righteous beings that never fell, right? Well, those exist, at least in the biblical cosmos. So why not just make more of those kind of trans world righteous tabula rasa souls and put a bunch of those in the context, and then they never fell? Or why not take, again, you only need 2. Mm-hmm. Why not take 2 of those? And you make them Adam and Eve, and then you just kibosh the entire system, right? Then you don't have any. Then you have every single human ever, because the fall doesn't happen. Now you have every single being ever, right? So I guess my thing is that it seems that the answers that Molinism has to provide to kind of wriggle out of things now just supply multiple defeater points for its own system if you feed them back into the system.
Yeah, I think what I would say then is, again, this is in the context of a undercutting defeaters. So hypothetically, the atheist is given the problem of evil. He has the burden of proof alone. So what I would push back and say, well, I don't think there are these infinite number of worlds where more people are achieve their ultimate purpose or achieve salvation compared relative to this world. So how do you prove that? What do you have? Modal faculties? You can count the number of souls that freely choose to be saved in this world versus other worlds. I think we're just assuming that given an actualized will, I think you can prove that there's a bunch of strictly logical possible worlds where, like maybe even more people in this world get saved. But when we're talking about feasibility, once a human being exists and has an actual will and they are exercising it, then I don't think there are these feasible worlds where more people than this world freely choose to be saved or ultimate purpose, whatever you want to say.
Yeah, I guess I would push back and say, well, there's a couple of things. One is lots of people object to this that aren't atheists, right? So I'm a theist. I object to it when there lots of Reformed, Catholic, lots of people reject this, right? So I think that you can't push back and say, well, the atheist has to demonstrate, this high burden. I would say, well, there's a bunch of people that have a very trivially low burden because they agree with a bunch of your starting points. But if you're going to say, okay, well, how do you metaphysically prove? How can you prove that there are these nearly infinite number of feasible worlds? I'm just going to say, well, I don't need to, right? You've granted that I can do it via imaginary fiat, right? Because you've done it for all of these metaphysically impossible things, right? You've said, well, the reason these aren't brought about is just because we can just say they're not feasible, right? Because reasons. And I'm going to say, well, for the same reason you can say they're not all feasible, I can say, well, all these ones are feasible, right? Neither of us are given justification. If you think that, if you think that's valid for your argument, I can help myself to it. If you want to push back on me, I'm going to say, okay, well, then you need to demonstrate to me every single feasible world, every single logically possible world I can think of, why it's not feasible to present.
And I fully confess.
Now you have a burden that's way bigger than you can bear.
Yes, exactly. And no, I fully agree. If I submitted this as an argument, I can't prove any more than I think the person advancing the problem of evil or divine hiddenness or anything can in terms of the actualized will. Like, I think because I treat free will, the actualized will, as this prime mover, indeterminate, whatever you want to say, like, I just don't think our modal evaluating faculties can speak to the to how many people would freely choose to be saved versus not based on a free will decision. It's just a black box for us. I can use them to speak to strict logical because there's no like a direct A, not A. But once you throw in the actualized free will, which is a black box, I would just point forward. Well, I can't prove that leads to a contradiction, saying that there's, trying to say there's a possible world where more free will creatures get saved than this world. I can't prove that there is no such feasible world. But neither can you prove that there's not vice versa. You know what I'm saying? So, and that's what we need to be able to decide, and we just can't. So,
but I think this is where I'm going to say, okay, but as the one, right, this is the argument you presented. As the one providing a defeater for your argument, I don't need to prove that, right? I'm not trying to prop up a competing metaphysical claim. I'm saying here's a potential defeater for your argument, right? It seems that you could, if you have this nearly infinite number of totally translord damned, it seems you have a nearly infinite number because there's a potentially infinite number of ways that of human beings that God could create, right? And if there's a potentially infinite number that are damned, there's no explicable reason why there aren't a potentially number that are transworld righteous, right? So if you can kind of conjure it definitionally by pure conceptual fiat, so can I. Mm-hmm. And if you want to say, well, you can't do that, then I'm going to say, okay, then neither can you. And so now my defeater still goes through because your argument, now you've just said, well, I can't prove a major premise of my argument. I'm going to say, okay, well, if you can't do that, now I have no independent reason to think your argument fails.
Cool.
Right? So, it seems like either my defeater goes through, or you provided me a reason, or you basically, or provided me a reason to think that you haven't given independent reason to think that your argument goes through. So I still shouldn't. I don't have a defeater, but now I have no reason to think that it's true.
Okay, cool. So that's again, this is in the context of an atheist gave an argument for the problem of evil with premises, and I was presenting this as a defeater. But let's pretend I presented this as I started it. I made a claim, and I'm claiming these premises are true. Perfect. I fully admit I fail, but that's a win for me. Is so long as you admit, yeah, but the guy who wants to claim that these premises aren't true, that there are feasible worlds, they also fail, and suspending a judgment is okay. That's cool with me. Like that's good enough to defeat things like the hiddenness of God or something.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, because I would give a whole bunch of other reasons, right? I mean, it really all it does is means with regard to this argument that Dale has given, we have to suspend belief, right? Mm-hmm. But I for you've listened to my you've said you've listened to a couple of my episodes and I have the whole metaphysics of Molinism. I give dozens of problems that I find with Molinism. Right, lots of them. I think that the argument that I gave earlier of, well, it seems that you're more free in the hypothetical than the actual, and so really God's middle knowledge isn't actually of your actions in the actual world, because that's a different type of freedom. So actually, his middle knowledge doesn't correspond to the actual world, because the properties of that are different, and so there you have a correspondence issue. So I mean, I think there are lots of other issues.
Fair enough.
I want to go back to there are some questions in the chat that we should probably answer, and then maybe we'll do another couple questions. We've been almost 2 hours.
Sounds good. Are you enjoying this? Is this good or?
Oh, this is fantastic. I love these discussions.
Same here.
Yeah. No, I think they're super interesting, and I do appreciate that. There are a lot of, let me say it this way. When I was a presuppositionalist, there are a lot of online presuppositionalists that I would just like cringe when they would talk, and all of the objections of like presuppositionalists just beg the question, or they just ad nauseum say by what standard, or they just all these kind of things. They're like, oh, that's right of like 75% of online presuppositionalists. The problem is that's not right for kind of academic presuppositionalists. I think that's true of a lot of Molinists. There are a lot of Molinists that do not represent it well, and walk headlong into problems without realizing it. And I think there are those problems. So I appreciate that you are very thoughtful, and are willing. I also appreciate that you're willing to say like, oh, yeah, we can concede some points and go back and forth, and I concede some points, and I like I said, I'm still going through some of the theism. Say, I have to rethink some of these things. I'm still working things out. I've always appreciate when I watch your contributions on some of the other channels and stuff. Your contributions are usually very, very thoughtful, and I appreciate them. So
yeah, awesome. Yeah, same
happy to have you.
Awesome, cool.
And we should discuss Bayes sometimes, because I didn't get to talk much on that episode, but it'd be a fun one.
Absolutely, anytime.
So let's do a couple questions here. Let's see. This one's for me. Can God determine what libertarian free creatures could do? I mean, I can answer this in two ways. One, I can say, if you mean, can God determine what libertarian free creatures would libertarianly freely do, the answer is no. That would just be a blatant contradiction. But many libertarians would say, well, of course God could determine what libertarian free creatures would do, just that action itself wouldn't be free. They would still have libertarian freedom. That just would not be an example of a libertarian free choice on them. So you have general libertarian freedom, but it doesn't mean that every single choice made is free and responsible. So yes, they could, but they couldn't do it while they were libertarian in that instant. Although I think God can determine what free creatures do, just not libertarian. Let's see. When God has so this was way back when we were talking, and Dave was talking about what can be proven. When God has already spoken and proven he is there in his word and his son Jesus and in creation, can you say he's not there? This was probably more of a question for Dave, and it's only partly for me. I'm a theist, so I think we can have good reason to know that God exists. I think that you would have to demonstrate that he has spoken in his word and in his son Jesus, and that's a far larger thing to do. I understand it's a YouTube comment, and I don't expect him to bear the burden there, but I would just say, well, there are many of us that don't think that has been reasonably demonstrated, and we have good reasons to think that's not the case. Dale, I don't know if you wanted to say much to that one.
Yeah, I get obviously I think I agree with HJM that God has spoken in the Bible, and he's proven that. By prove, I just mean on a balance of probabilities. I think he's given us evidence that is sufficient on that front, that Christianity is true, or at the very least, it's the religion that God endorses. He wants us to follow to achieve our ultimate purpose. I know, people know about I had 4 evidences at the time of my conversion. So there's the historical evidence for the resurrection. Specifically for me, it's the appearance of the 12. That's the only one that I think doesn't have an equally probable natural explanation or something like that. I also have my vindication argument, a inner witness of the Holy Spirit, and something that I tried to influence Tyler to look into a bit, the formation of the images on the Shroud of Turin, I think, are a religion authenticating event. And yeah, so I agree. God has given us sufficient evidence.
Okay. This came up. I saw this one come up. I don't believe you're the free thinker. This one I said that I would happily believe if there was evidence. You don't have to believe me. I don't know what to tell you. I know that I would be if there was evidence. If there was evidence for it. It's weird to say I don't believe you, right? I can think of all kinds of ways in other relationships where I would say, oh, I'd be happy to be. If you think of relationships that in your past have been, and you say, well, I'd be happy to stay in this relationship if the person worked and showed up and wasn't toxic and all that kind of stuff. I'd be happy to continue working on it. I don't know how to say what I would be happy to do otherwise outside of what I internally know I'd be happy to do and believe. That's all I can speak to. I
just have to say this is a surreal experience. I think this is the first time I've ever done a podcast where the majority of the audience is not against me. They seem to be supporting my point of view. So this is the first time. I've never had this before. So very good. Interesting.
All right. Yeah. But I would go and say, I can think of all kinds of, if I had a Paul on the road to Damascus experience, I would believe. And I don't want to make it in the sense of like a Matt Dillahunty or like the online skeptic. Well, God would know what would make me believe. I think that we can come up with reasonable thresholds of what we should reasonably believe. I think, for example, I'm still a theist. I don't affirm scientism, for example. I think God, again, I'm not saying that God should do this, but there are paradigmatic examples. If God rearranged all the stars for the entire world to see, Yahweh exists, repent and believe in Jesus, and all the stars rearranged, and everyone saw them. Yeah, I believe. Yeah, 1,000% I would believe. Obviously that's a paradigm that's extreme example. There are far smaller examples. I know during my apostasy, if even like a feel, I would have stayed even from an internal feeling of comfort and love in a transcendent type of way. I would have stayed there. Zero doubt I would have stayed. If it happens now, probably would return. So there are all kinds of things that would I can think of that would make me repent and believe again.
There's something. So I wanted to. Well, let me ask you: is it okay if I follow up? Because you asked me a question when we were doing the Bayes Theorem show on SNS, and I at the time I'm like, there's at least 2, maybe 3 ways to answer this. So I just opted for something. But you kind of gave this. You said let's pretend I give you not propositional knowledge or a philosophical argument that God exists or Christianity is true. For you, let's say Christianity is true, and even it's to a 100% degree, but yet you lack any experiential knowledge that Christianity is true or any of the experiential proofs and stuff like that. And I said that, yeah, like if I have 100% degree of knowledge, a warranted true belief from propositional or arguments or something, and I lack experiential evidences or something, then that is, I would believe that's sufficient. The only case I wouldn't is if it's an obvious contradiction. Like if you're saying I have 100% propositional proof that I'm having an experience and I have 100% degree of knowledge that I'm not having that experience, well, that's a violation of the logical law of non-contradiction, and I don't know what to do with my life. But if there's degrees, right? I interpreted your question as saying, let's pretend I've got 100% through propositional knowledge. and I'm like 90% convinced that through experientially Christianity's false because I'm not experiencing transcendent comfort, whatever you say, I would follow the highest degree of warrant. I would still believe Christianity is true because the source of that warrant doesn't matter. We follow what we know to be true. Yeah. So like, what do you want to like? Does that help explain what I meant?
It does. But so this is where and you know, I had a little bit of time, and my kids were running around in the background, so I didn't get to hash it out. Part of what the issue for me is that with regard to Christianity, at least, right? It's not purely a propositional thing, right? There are propositions about relational experiential things. So I remember back when I was doing when I did a lot of like pastoral counseling, we talked, you know, to husbands and wives, and we said, look, you know, you talk a lot about love language and all that kind of stuff. You say, look, if the husband thinks that he's loving his wife well, but the wife is sitting there saying, I don't think you love me. I never feel loved. And not because she's unrealistic. She's not saying, well, you only love me if you give me like a Mercedes and, you know, whatever, right? Yeah. She's saying, look, I don't feel, there's a certain sense where I'm going to say, okay, love condescends in the good way. Love is tailored to the beloved, right? To love someone is to love them in a way, not always, right? Sometimes as a parent, I love my kids in ways they don't feel loved. But if my kids were like, we don't even know God, we don't know dad loves us at all. We don't even know that he's around. He's never around. We never talked to him. We've never seen him, all that kind of stuff. But someone had convinced them propositionally that they have a dad who loves them and is in their daily life and wants their best welfare, all that kind of stuff. Even though he has brought, you know, cancer and death and illness and all that kind of stuff in their lives and has killed their friends and all that kind of stuff. There's going to be a certain part where I'm going to say the existence of one in the negative, like, so if you think of the story of Job, right? The existence of the negative and the absence of the positive just make it so you can't propositionally know that, right? Because the proposition just would be true. If the proposition was true, those states of affairs wouldn't exist. Right. So I brought this up a lot in my video where I'm saying, if God is love, right? So whatever love is what God is, right? I understand the creator creature distinction where we can say, oh, well, God has certain prerogatives that we don't have. But if God can love in ways that would be unloving for us to do, then I don't know what it means to say that I can know propositionally that God is love if I also can know that God being love can be unloving, right? That just seems to be, well, we can't be married bachelors, but God can be a married bachelor. I don't know what that means anymore. Same. So when I talk about the experiential thing versus the propositional thing, I was driving at the point of saying, okay, but do you see how the lack of existential or experiential data and knowledge actually can contradict that propositional? You can't have the pure propositional without the existential, and the existential may weigh more heavily, right? So you may on paper have 90% warrant for the intellectual, but if you even if you have only that 10% of the existential, that may be weighted more heavily, such that now you're down to 30% over kind of your net overall. Does that kind of make sense?
Of course, yeah. No, that's absolutely right. Like, obviously, it could be the case. For example, in the case of Islam, the negative evidence is outweighed. My degree of warrant or knowledge that is the God of Islam is unloving or immoral, I guess I would say is how I evaluate it, outweighed any of the positive evidences trying to say that he is loving. And so in that case, yeah, I would say that I think the God of Islam is probably an immoral God and that sort of thing. So yes, I absolutely take your point that the lack of experiential things can be converted into a propositional argument. That's how I would treat it as negative evidence against the hypothesis. So totally agree. Even though I disagree with you in fact that it does. Yeah.
All once saved, always saved are derivatives of Calvinism. That's just wildly wrong. I think a lot of Jesuits predating Calvinism would be very surprised by this statement.
Even I know that this isn't my area of expertise, but even I know there's 4-point Calvinists. Like my old church is 5-point tulip, full tulip officially, but like even the deacon, he's like, I don't believe in the P kind of thing. So once saved, always saved. So
yeah, there are a lot of provisionists who would freak out about this. But just even the anachronism of their once saved, always, or eternal security, or however you want to describe it, that believers could not be unjustified, far predates Calvinism and the Reformation. So,
gotcha. Yeah.
How can you not believe in an election anymore? You mean according to the scriptures you don't, or just done bending God's word anymore and therefore don't believe? Just it's a weird question. Was he insinuating that Calvinists did bend it together? No, I just don't believe in the Bible. I think that, especially in the New Testament, I think the overwhelming exegetical case is that the elect are eternally elect, and so if someone is saved, they cannot be unsaved. They can't go from justified to unjustified. I just don't think the Bible is true anymore in its grand narrative. That doesn't mean there aren't true things in it, but just in its grand narrative. Yeah, you're getting a break from all of these questions.
Yeah, no, it's it's an interesting experience. Yeah.
I'm trying to see if there are anything specific about Molinism. We'll wrap up here in a minute. We've been going over 2 hours. So
sounds good.
Let's see. I think this is a question for you. Oh no, this is a question for someone in the chat. But you can answer. Could God not determine things based on his power? I will do this. This will happen instead of set known future. I think he's an open theist. Yeah, his prior comment is maybe the future doesn't exist.
So yeah, it is true. I take an A theory of time. So I like William Lane Craig. I don't think the future does exist, but I am a true. So one of the counters, someone like William Lane Craig might deny he's not a truth maker maximalist, right? So he would just say for future tense propositions, as well as for future tense counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, there doesn't need to be a truth maker. Tyler's grounding objections beside the point. I disagree with that. I am a truth maker maximalist. So I think that these things do need to be grounded in something that actually exists and grounds it. And that's why I ground it in God's causal power and stuff. That's what I think. And also for future tense propositions, they're grounded in God's mind. I'm a divine conceptualist on that front. So yeah, I think that these things do need to be grounded in some internal aspect of God in one way or another. So yeah, future tense propositions, they exist in God's mind, just like every other fact.
Yeah, so I'd caveat that, and you may like this, and I brought this up. This came up in my debate with Warren McGrew, and he just conceptually could not understand this, and then kept going on, being like, "Oh, Tyler said God doesn't have thoughts, and God can't have tense, not all this kind of stuff."
Oh no!
So
I gotta see that.
God can have knowledge about wetness, but it doesn't mean God's knowledge is wet. Modal properties don't transfer that way. McGrew actually weirdly makes this modal collapse fallacy type of objection. So God being outside of time doesn't mean God can't know tense facts in that they are in their relativity to other facts, right? So the example that I normally give is Hamlet. We're tense beings, but it's kind of irrelevant for this. We stand outside of the timeline of Hamlet's Denmark. We are not time bound inside of Hamlet's Denmark. I can know the tensed fact Ophelia will commit suicide with respect to Act 1, everything in Act 1. Mm-hmm. Right? I can know that tensed fact, but it doesn't mean my knowledge of that fact is tensed. right? I don't know. It doesn't make sense to say, for me, Ophelia will commit suicide. We're in different timelines. I know that as a tense fact within its tense context.
Mm-hmm.
My knowledge doesn't have to be tensed of it, right? So God can have knowledge of tensed facts, but McGrew and the open theists want to say, well, God can only know that if God is in time and God's knowledge itself is tensed. And I'm just gonna say, well, that's just dumb. Like, we know that's not even true with regard to our own knowledge, right? Again, I can know tense facts about things that which I am not tensed. Why can't God, who is outside of time, have knowledge of tense facts within our temporal timeline?
I'll just say things were going so well, but now you're going to think I'm dumb, because I actually do agree with that line of reasoning. I agree with you that those are different propositions when you attach temporal coordinates or assign earlier than or later than relations. Yes, there are propositions that people can know, and God knows those kind of thing, right? But I think that there are specific tensed propositions that can only be understood within time. So I guess I would qualify as dumb as well. But on that front,
you may have to, though, because you're not an open theist, right? You may just have to say, well, those are not the type of knowledge that God can logically possibly have. Right. So for the example, we would also, this isn't a violation of omnipotence. We would just say it's not logically possible for God to have first person knowledge of my first person experience. Right. Yep. That's just logically incoherent, right? Because God is not my person. God can have third person propositional knowledge about my knowledge. Yep. Right. So I would look at it and say, well, God doesn't know tensed facts.
See,
God knows facts that are tensed. Right. So God doesn't know I will do this, and then I had done this. God knows with respect to creation, maybe to put it kind of philosophically, at T1, Tyler chooses X with respect to whatever, right? His knowledge may just be, he may not have tensed. He just doesn't have tense knowledge. He's not a tensed being.
See, the only thing is, so I can get that if we're talking about experiential knowledge or knowledge by acquaintance. Like, God has no idea what it's like to be me or to be a sinner. He's never sinned. He doesn't know the experience. That's what I think Adam and Eve, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, it's experiential knowledge that they gained, contrastive knowledge kind of thing, right? But when you say, well, there's some kind of true propositional knowledge that God can't have, then now you're saying, well, God's not a say. There's certain true propositions out there floating independent of God in some way, and that's where I'm a little bit
iffy. Right. Okay. So God can know those as true propositions, but he doesn't have to. His knowledge. So you're doing like a modal collapse, right? You're saying whatever is true of the proposition has to be true of the knowledge about the proposition, right? So God can know that there is this tensed fact with regard to the timeline it's in, right? You can know Ophelia will commit suicide, but it's not will for you, right? The tense is entirely constituted within the timeline for within it's found, right? I can say you have knowledge of tensed facts within Hamlet's Denmark. That doesn't mean that your proposition and your knowledge of those propositions is itself tensed. Now, we're tense beings. We might say that you came to know that as you studied Hamlet or whatever it is, right? But none of us are going to say, well, God learns that way, right? So we would just stop at the proposition knowledge about the tense fact. But what you can't do is you can't take that tense operator and transfer it from the proposition itself to the knowledge of the proposition, right? That's just an invalid move, right? That's just an invalid modal transfer. So it's entirely consistent to say that God, as a timeless being, knows tense facts tenselessly, because the tenselessly is the way that his knowledge is held, but he can know the tense fact because he can know that they're tense with regard to the tense that they're in.
Fair enough. Yep. I understand what you're saying. Yeah, this is a respected position and stuff. I'm still skeptical of it, but I'll definitely give it a thought over kind of things. I respect your opinion. So yeah, cool.
I think that we should probably, I don't see any other
questions.
Yeah, I think that's all we got. We're at 2 hours and 15 anyways. Dale, thank you so much for coming on. I really, really appreciate you. If people want to find you, I actually need to update the description. I need to put yours and David's links in there. But if people could, you want them to find you, where can people track you down?
Yeah, so my blog, which is the most important thing to me because that's where I put sources and stuff for free PDFs and papers and stuff, is realseekerministries.wordpress.com. Otherwise, if you want to listen to podcasts and shows, I'm available anywhere. YouTube, just search Real Seekers, plural with an S, or on Rumble Video and Spotify and all those places. And yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining, and we'll have to have you on again sometime to have another discussion.
Absolutely.
Right,
anytime.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
All right. And for those watching, thank you again for joining. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, commendations, or condemnations, please feel free to reach out to me. You can reach out at the email at freethinkerpodcast@gmail.com. Visit the blog at freethinkerpodcast.blogspot.com. I'm going to put a link in the show notes. I have a whole collection dealing with Molinism. You can follow the links there, or you can come and by the group page on Facebook. As always, thank you so much for joining me. Have a wonderful evening.